militant all-Russia organization? These questions have long engaged the mind of the author, who tried to raise them in Rабочая Gazeta during one of the unsuccessful attempts to revive that paper, see Chapter 5. But the original plan to confine the pamphlet to an analysis of only these three questions, and to set forth our views as far as possible in a positive form, without or almost without entering into polemics, proved wholly impracticable for two reasons. On the one hand, economism proved to be much more tenacious than we had supposed. We employ the term economism in the broad sense, as explained in Iskra number 12, December 1901, in the article entitled A Talk with Defenders of Economism, which was a synopsis, so to speak, of the present pamphlet. It became clear beyond doubt that the differences regarding the solution of the three questions mentioned were explainable to a far greater degree by the basic antithesis between the two trends in the Russian social democratic movement than by differences over details. On the other hand, the perplexity of the economists over the practical application of our views in Iskra clearly revealed that we often speak literally in different tongues, and therefore cannot arrive at an understanding without beginning ab ovo, and that an attempt must be made in the simplest possible style, illustrated by numerous and concrete examples, systematically to clarify all our basic points of difference with all the economists. I resolved to make such an attempt at clarification, fully realizing that it would greatly increase the size of the pamphlet and delay its publication. I saw no other way of meeting my pledge I had made in the article Where to Begin. Thus, to the apologies for the delay, I must add others for the serious literary shortcomings of the pamphlet. I had to work in great haste with frequent interruptions by a variety of other tasks. The examination of the above three questions still constitutes the main theme of this pamphlet, but I found it necessary to begin with two questions of a more general nature. Why such an innocent and natural slogan as freedom of criticism should be for us a veritable war cry, and why we cannot come to an understanding even on the fundamental question of the role of social democrats in relation to the spontaneous mass movement. Further, the exposition of our views on the character and substance of political agitation developed into an explanation of the difference between trade unionist politics and social democratic politics, while the exposition of our views on organizational tasks developed into an explanation of the difference between the amateurish methods which satisfy the economists and the organization of revolutionaries which we hold to be indispensable. Further, I advanced the plan for an all-Russia political newspaper, with all the more insistence because the objections raised against it are untenable, and because no real answer has been given to the question I raised in the article Where to Begin, as to how we can set to work from all sides simultaneously to create the organization we need. Finally, in the concluding part, I hope to show that we did all we could to prevent a decisive break with the economists, a break which nevertheless proved inevitable, that Rабочее Дело acquired a special significance, a historical significance, if you will, because it expressed fully and strikingly, not consistent economism, but the confusion and vacillation which constitute the distinguishing feature of an entire period in the history of Russian social democracy, and that therefore the polemic with Rабочее Дело, which may upon first view seem excessively detailed, also acquires significance, for we can make no progress until we have completely put an end to this period. N. Lenin, February 1902. Chapter 1. Dogmatism and Freedom of Criticism. 1.1. What does freedom of criticism mean? Freedom of criticism is undoubtedly the most fashionable slogan at the present time, and the one most frequently employed in the controversies between socialists and Democrats in all countries. At first sight, nothing would appear to be more strange than the solemn appeals to freedom of criticism made by one of the parties to the dispute. Have voices been raised in the advanced parties against the constitutional law of the majority of European countries which guarantees freedom to science and scientific investigation? Something must be wrong here, will be the comment of the onlooker who has heard this fashionable slogan repeated at every turn, but has not yet penetrated the essence of the disagreement among the disputants. Evidently, this slogan is one of the most controversial phrases, which, like nicknames, become legitimized by use and become almost generic terms. In fact, it is no secret for anyone that two trends have taken form in present-day international social democracy. The conflict between these trends now flares up in a bright flame and now dies down, and smolders under the ashes of imposing, quote, truce resolutions. The essence of the, quote, new trend, which adopts a, quote, critical attitude towards, quote, obsolete dogmatic Marxism, has been clearly enough presented by Bernstein and demonstrated by Millerand. Social democracy must change from a party of social revolution into a democratic party of social reforms. Bernstein has surrounded this political demand with a whole battery of well-attuned, quote, new arguments and reasonings. Denied was the possibility of putting socialism on a scientific basis and of demonstrating its necessity and inevitability from the point of view of the materialist conception of history. Denied was the fact of growing impoverishment, the process of proletarization, and the intensification of capitalist contradictions. The very concept, the quote, ultimate aim, was declared to be unsound, and the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat was completely rejected. Denied was the antithesis in principle between liberalism and socialism. Denied was the theory of the class struggle, on the alleged grounds that it could not be applied to a strictly democratic society governed according to the will of the majority, etc. Quick comment from Socialism for All. Just so you see here, they were already calling Marxism obsolete and dogmatic as early as 1902, which to me just says they never really wanted to hear it. They say it today, they said it in the 50s, they said it in 1902. As you can see, they just don't want to hear it. People who don't accept class struggle don't accept that capitalism runs on simple logic. Marxism was correct then, and it's still correct now, because the logic of capitalism has not changed. Okay, back to the text. Thus, the demand for a decisive turn from revolutionary social democracy to bourgeois social reformism was accompanied by a no less decisive turn toward bourgeois criticism of all the fundamental ideas of Marxism. In view of the fact that this criticism of Marxism has long been directed from the political platform, from university chairs, in numerous pamphlets, and in a series of learned treatises, in view of the fact that the entire younger generation of the educated classes has been systematically reared for decades on this criticism, it is not surprising that the, quote, new critical trend in social democracy should spring up all complete like Minerva from the head of Jove. The content of this new trend did not have to grow and take shape. It was transferred bodily from bourgeois to socialist literature. To proceed, if Bernstein's theoretical criticism and political yearnings were still unclear to anyone, the French took the trouble strikingly to demonstrate the, quote, new method. In this instance, too, France has justified its old reputation of being, quote, the land where, more than anywhere else, the historical class struggles were each time fought out to a decision, quote, from Engels' introduction to Marx's 18th Brumaire. The French socialists have begun not to theorize, but to act. The democratically more highly developed political conditions in France have permitted them to put, quote, Bernsteinism into practice immediately, with all its consequences. Millerand has furnished an excellent example of practical Bernsteinism. Not without reason did Bernstein and Volmar rush so zealously to defend and laud him. Indeed, if social democracy, in essence, is merely a party of reform, and must be bold enough to admit this openly, then not only has a socialist the right to join a bourgeois cabinet, but he must always strive to do so. If democracy, in essence, means the abolition of class domination, then why should not a socialist minister charm the whole bourgeois world by orations on class collaboration? Why should he not remain in the cabinet even after the shooting down of workers by gendarmes has exposed, for the 100th and 1000th time, the real nature of the democratic collaboration of classes? Why should he not personally take part in greeting the Tsar, for whom the French socialists now have no other name than hero of the gallows, knout and exile? And the reward for this utter humiliation and self-degradation of socialism in the face of the whole world, for the corruption of the socialist consciousness of the working masses, the only basis that can guarantee our victory. The reward for this is pompous projects from miserable reforms, so miserable in fact that much more has been obtained from bourgeois governments. He who does not deliberately close his eyes cannot fail to see that the new, quote, critical trend in socialism is nothing more nor less than a new variety of opportunism. And if we judge people not by the glittering uniforms they don or by the high-sounding appellations they give themselves, but by their actions and by what they actually advocate, it will be clear that, quote, freedom of criticism means freedom for an opportunistic trend in social democracy, freedom to convert social democracy into a democratic party of reform, freedom to introduce bourgeois ideas and bourgeois elements into socialism. Quick comment there from S4A. Opportunism, what is it? Opportunism is when people claim to be socialists and then they look at an alliance with a party which contains a fundamental difference that is not resolvable, and they just sort of paper over this fundamental difference. So in other words, it's somebody who proposes an alliance with somebody with whom an alliance really is not possible. Okay, back to the text. Freedom is a grand word, but under the banner of freedom for industry, the most predatory wars were waged. Under the banner of freedom of labor, the working people were robbed. The modern use of the term freedom of criticism contains the same inherent falsehood. Those who are really convinced that they have made progress in science would not demand freedom for the new views to continue side by side with the old, but the substitution of the new views for the old. The cry heard today, "Long live freedom of criticism," is too strongly reminiscent of the fable of the empty barrel. We are marching in a compact group along a precipitous and difficult path, firmly holding each other by the hand. We are surrounded on all sides by enemies, and we have to advance almost constantly under their fire. We have combined, by a freely adopted decision, for the purpose of fighting the enemy, and not of retreating into the neighboring marsh, the inhabitants of which, from the very outset, have reproached us with having separated ourselves into an exclusive group, and with having chosen the path of struggle ahead of the path of conciliation. And now some among us begin to cry out, "Let us go into the marsh." And when we begin to shame them, they retort, "What backward people you are! Are you not ashamed to deny us the liberty to invite you to take a better road?" Oh yes, gentlemen, you are free not only to invite us, but to go yourselves wherever you will, even into the marsh. In fact, we think that the marsh is your proper place, and we are prepared to render you every assistance to get there. Only let go of our hands, don't clutch at us, and don't besmirch the grand word freedom, for we too are free to go where we please, free to fight not only against the marsh, but also against those who are turning toward the marsh. Section 1.2. The new advocates of freedom of criticism. Now, this slogan, freedom of criticism, has in recent times been solemnly advanced by Рабочее дело number 10, organ of the Union of Russian Social Democrats Abroad, not as a theoretical postulate, but as a political demand, as a reply to the question, is it possible to unite the social democratic organizations operating abroad? For a durable unity, there must be freedom of criticism, quote, they say. From this statement, two definite conclusions follow. One, that Рабочее дело has taken under its wing the opportunist trend in international social democracy in general, and two, that Рабочее дело demands freedom for opportunism in Russian social democracy. Let us examine these conditions. Рабочее дело is, quote, particularly displeased with the, quote, inclination of Iskra and Zarya to predict a rupture between the Mountain and the Gironde in international social democracy. Generally speaking, writes B. Khrushchevsky, editor of Рабочее дело, quote, this talk of the Mountain and the Gironde heard in the ranks of social democracy represents a shallow historical analogy, a strange thing to come from the pen of a Marxist. The Mountain and Gironde did not represent different temperaments or intellectual trends as the historians of social thought may think, but different classes or strata, the middle bourgeoisie on the one hand and the petty bourgeoisie and the proletariat on the other. In the modern socialist movement, however, there is no conflict of class interests. The socialist movement in its entirety, in all of its diverse forms, including the pronounced Bernsteinians, stands on the basis of the class interests of the proletariat and its class struggle for political and economic emancipation, unquote. A bold assertion. Has not Krzyzewski heard of the fact, long ago noted, that it is precisely the extensive participation of a, quote, academic stratum in the socialist movement in recent years that has promoted such a rapid spread of Bernsteinism? And what is most important, on what does our author found his opinion that even, quote, the most pronounced Bernsteinians stand on the basis of the class struggle for the political and economic emancipation of the proletariat? No one knows. This determined defense of the most pronounced Bernsteinians is not supported by any argument or reasoning whatsoever. Apparently, the author believes that if he repeats what the most pronounced Bernsteinians say about themselves, his assertion requires no proof. But can anything more, quote, shallow be imagined than this judgment of an entire trend based on nothing more than what the representatives of that trend say about themselves? Can anything more shallow be imagined than the subsequent homily on the two different and even diametrically opposite types or paths of party development? The German Social Democrats, in other words, recognize complete freedom of criticism, but the French do not, and it is precisely their example that demonstrates the, quote, bane of intolerance. To this we can only say that the very example B. Krzyzewski affords us attests to the fact that the name Marxists is at times assumed by people who conceive history literally in the Ilovaisky manner, to explain the unity of the German Socialist Party and the disunity of the French Socialist Party. There is no need whatever to go into the special features in the history of these countries, to contrast the conditions of military semi-absolutism in the one with republican parliamentarism in the other, to analyze the effects of the Paris Commune and the effects of the exceptional law against the socialists, to compare the economic life and economic development of the two countries, or to recall that, quote, the unexampled growth of German social democracy was accompanied by a strenuous struggle, unique in the history of socialism, not only against erroneous theories, Muhlenberger, Düring, the Catheter socialists, but also against erroneous tactics, Lassalle, etc., etc. All that is superfluous. The French quarrel among themselves because they are intolerant. The Germans are united because they are good boys. And observe, this piece of matchless profundity is designed to refute the fact that puts to rout the defense of the Bernsteinians. The question whether or not the Bernsteinians stand on the basis of the class struggle of the proletariat is one that can be completely and irrevocably answered only by historical experience. Consequently, the example of France holds greatest significance in this respect because France is the only country in which the Bernsteinians attempted to stand independently on their own feet with the warm approval of their German colleagues and partly also of the Russian opportunists. The reference to the intolerance of the French, apart from its historical significance, turns out to be merely an attempt to hush up very unpleasant facts with angry invectives. Nor are we inclined to make a present of the Germans to Krzyzewski and the numerous other champions of freedom of criticism. If the, quote, most pronounced Bernsteinians are still tolerated in the ranks of the German party, it is only to the extent that they submit to the Hanover Resolution, which emphatically rejected Bernstein's amendments, and to the Lubeck Resolution, which, notwithstanding the diplomatic terms in which it is couched, contains a direct warning to Bernstein. It is debatable, from the standpoint of the interests of the German party, whether diplomacy was appropriate and whether, in this case, a bad peace is better than a good quarrel. In short, opinions may differ as to the expediency of any one of the methods employed to reject Bernsteinism. But that the German party did reject Bernsteinism on two occasions is a fact that no one can fail to see. Therefore, to think that the German example confirms the thesis that, quote, the most pronounced Bernsteinians stand on the basis of the class struggle of the proletariat for political and economic emancipation, unquote, means to fail completely to understand what is going on under our very eyes. Nor is that all. As we have seen, Raboccia Diello demands, quote, freedom of criticism, and defends Bernsteinism before Russian social democracy. Apparently, it convinced itself that we were unfair to our critics and Bernsteinians. But to which ones? Who, where, when? What did the unfairness represent? About this, not a word. Raboccia Diello does not name a single Russian critic or Bernsteinian. We are left with but one of two possible suppositions. Either the unfairly treated party is none other than Raboccia Diello itself. This is confirmed by the fact that in the two articles in number 10, reference is made only to the wrongs suffered by Raboccia Diello at the hands of Zara and Iskra. If that is the case, how is the strange fact to be explained that Raboccia Diello, which always vehemently dissociated itself from all solidarity with Bernsteinism, could not defend itself without putting in a word in defense of the most pronounced Bernsteinians and of freedom of criticism, or some third persons have been treated unfairly? If this is the case, then what reasons may there be for not naming them? We see, therefore, that Raboccia Diello is continuing to play the game of hide-and-seek it has played, as we shall show below, ever since its founding. And let us note further this first practical application of the vaunted freedom of criticism. In actual fact, not only was it forthwith reduced to abstention from all criticism, but also to abstention from expressing independent views altogether. The very Raboccia Diello, which avoids mentioning Russian Bernsteinism as if it were a shameful disease, to use Starover's apt expression, proposes for the treatment of this disease to copy word for word the latest German prescription for the German variety of the malady. Instead of freedom of criticism, slavish, worse, apish imitation. The very same social and political content of modern international opportunism reveals itself in a variety of ways according to national peculiarities. In one country, the opportunists have long ago come out under a separate flag. In another, they have ignored theory and in fact pursued the policy of the radical socialists. In a third, some members of the Revolutionary Party have deserted to the camp of opportunism and strive to achieve their aims, not in open struggle for principles and for new tactics, but by gradual, imperceptible, and, if one may so put it, unpunishable corruption of their party. In a fourth country, similar deserters employ the same methods in the gloom of political slavery, and with a completely original combination of legal and illegal activity, etc. To talk of freedom of criticism and of Bernsteinism as a condition for uniting the Russian Social Democrats, and not to explain how Russian Bernsteinism has manifested itself and what particular fruits it has borne, amounts to talking with the aim of saying nothing. Let ourselves try, if only in a few words, to say what Raboccia Diello did not want to say, or which was, perhaps, beyond its comprehension. 1.3. Criticism in Russia. The chief distinguishing feature of Russia in regard to the point we are examining is that the very beginning of the spontaneous working class movement, on the one hand, and of the turn of progressive public opinion towards Marxism on the other, was marked by the combination of manifestly heterogeneous elements under a common flag to fight the common enemy, the obsolete social and political world outlook. We refer to the heyday of, quote, legal Marxism. Speaking generally, this was an altogether curious phenomenon that no one in the 80s or the beginning of the 90s would have believed possible. In a country ruled by an autocracy, with a completely enslaved press, in a period of desperate political reaction in which even the tiniest outgrowth of political discontent and protest is persecuted, the theory of revolutionary Marxism suddenly forces its way into the censored literature and, though expounded in Aesopian language, is understood by all the interested. The government had accustomed itself to regarding only the theory of the revolutionary Narodnaya Volya as dangerous, without, as is usual, observing its internal evolution and rejoicing at any criticism leveled against it. Quite a considerable time elapsed, by our Russian standards, before the government realized what had happened and the unwieldy army of censors and gendarmes discovered the new enemy and flung itself upon him. Meanwhile, Marxist books were published one after another, Marxist journals and newspapers were founded, nearly everyone became a Marxist, Marxists were flattered, Marxists were courted, and the book publishers rejoiced at the extraordinary ready sale of Marxist literature. It was quite natural, therefore, that among the Marxian neophytes who were caught up in this atmosphere, there should be more than one, quote, author who got a swelled head. We can now speak calmly of this period as of an event of the past. It is no secret that the brief period in which Marxism blossomed on the surface of our literature was called forth by an alliance between people of extreme and of very moderate views. In point of fact, the latter were bourgeois Democrats. This conclusion, so markedly confirmed by their subsequent critical development, suggested itself to some even when the, quote, alliance was still intact. That being the case, are not the revolutionary social democrats who entered into the alliance with the future, quote, critics, mainly responsible for the subsequent, quote, confusion? This question, together with a reply in the affirmative, is sometimes heard from people with too rigid a view, but such people are entirely in the wrong. Only those who are not sure of themselves can fear to enter into temporary alliances even with unreliable people. Not a single political party could exist without such alliances. The combination with the legal Marxists was, in its way, the first really political alliance entered into by Russian Social Democrats. Thanks to this alliance, an astonishingly rapid victory was obtained over Narodism, and Marxist ideas, even though in a vulgarized form, became very widespread. Moreover, the alliance was not concluded altogether without conditions. Evidence of this is the burning by the censor in 1895 of the Marxist collection Material on the Question of the Economic Development of Russia. If the literary agreement with the legal Marxists can be compared with a political alliance, then that book can be compared with a political treaty. The rupture, of course, did not occur because the, quote, allies proved to be bourgeois Democrats. On the contrary, the representatives of the latter trend are natural and desirable allies of social democracy insofar as its democratic tasks, brought to the fore by the prevailing situation in Russia, are concerned. But an essential condition for such an alliance must be the full opportunity for the socialists to reveal to the working class that its interests are diametrically opposed to the interests of the bourgeoisie. However, the Bernsteinian and critical trend, to which the majority of the legal Marxists turned, deprived the socialists of this opportunity and demoralized the socialist consciousness by vulgarizing Marxism, by advocating the theory of the blunting of social contradictions, by declaring the idea of the social revolution and of the dictatorship of the proletariat to be absurd, by reducing the working class movement and the class struggle to narrow trade unionism, and to a, quote, realistic struggle for petty, gradual reforms. This was synonymous with bourgeois democracy's denial of socialism's right to independence, and, consequently, of its right to existence. In practice, it meant a striving to convert the nascent working class movement into an appendage of the liberals. Naturally, under such circumstances, the rupture was necessary, but the, quote, peculiar feature of Russia manifested itself in the fact that this rupture simply meant the elimination of the Social Democrats from the most accessible and widespread, quote, legal literature. The, quote, ex-Marxists who took up the flag of, quote, criticism and who obtained almost a monopoly to, quote, demolish Marxism, entrenched themselves in this literature. Catchwords like against orthodoxy and long live freedom of criticism, now repeated by Rабочее дело, forthwith became the vogue, and the fact that neither the censor nor the gendarmes could resist this vogue is apparent from the publication of 3 Russian editions of the work of the celebrated Bernstein, celebrated in the Herostratian sense, and from the fact that the works of Bernstein, Mr. Prokopovich, and others were recommended by Zubetov in Iskra number 10. A task now devolved upon the Social Democrats that was difficult in itself and was made incredibly more difficult by purely external obstacles, the task of combating the new trend. This trend did not confine itself to the sphere of literature. The turn towards criticism was accompanied by an infatuation for economism, among social democratic practical workers. The manner in which the connection between and interdependence of legal criticism and illegal economism arose and grew is in itself an interesting subject, one that could serve as the theme of a special article. We need only note here that this connection undoubtedly existed. The notoriety deservedly acquired by the Credo was due precisely to the frankness with which it formulated this connection and blurted out the fundamental political tendency of economism. Let the workers carry on the economic struggle. It would be more correct to say the trade unionist struggle, because the latter also embraces specifically working class politics. And let the Marxist intelligentsia merge with the liberals for the political, quote, struggle. Thus, trade unionist work, quote, among the people, meant fulfilling the first part of this task, while legal criticism meant fulfilling the second. This statement was such an excellent weapon against economism that, had there been no Credo, it would have been worth inventing one. The Credo was not invented, but it was published without the consent and perhaps even against the will of its authors. At all events, the present writer, who took part in dragging this new program into the light of day, has heard complaints and reproaches to the effect that copies of the resume of the speaker's views were distributed, dubbed the Credo, and even published in the press together with the protest. We refer to this episode because it reveals a very peculiar feature of our economism, fear of publicity. This is a feature of economism generally, and not of the authors of the Credo alone. It was revealed by that most outspoken and honest advocate of economism, Rabocea Missile, and by Rabocea Diello, which was indignant over the publication of economist documents in the Vademecum, as well as by the Kiev Committee, which 2 years ago refused to permit the publication of its profession de foi, together with the repudiation of it, and by many other individual representatives of economism. This fear of criticism displayed by the advocates of freedom of criticism cannot be attributed solely to craftiness, although, on occasion, no doubt craftiness is brought into play. It would be improvident to expose the young and as yet frail shoots of the new trend to attacks by opponents. No, the majority of the economists look with sincere resentment, as by the very nature of economism they must, upon all theoretical controversies, factional disagreements, broad political questions, plans for organizing revolutionaries, etc. Quote, "Leave all that to the people abroad," said a fairly consistent economist to me one day, thereby expressing a very widespread, and again purely trade unionist view. Our concern is the working class movement, the workers' organizations here in our localities, and all the rest is merely the invention of doctrinaires, quote, "the overrating of ideology," as the authors of the letter, published in Iskra number 12, expressed it in unison with Rabocea Diello number 10. The question now arises, such being the peculiar features of Russian criticism and Russian Bernsteinism, what should have been the task of those who sought to oppose opportunism in deeds and not merely in words? First, they should have made efforts to resume the theoretical work that had barely begun in the period of legal Marxism, and that fell anew on the shoulders of the comrades working underground. Without such work, the successful growth of the movement was impossible. Secondly, they should have actively combated the legal criticism that was perverting people's minds on a considerable scale. Thirdly, they should have actively opposed confusion and vacillation in the practical movement, exposing and repudiating every conscious or unconscious attempt to degrade our program and our tactics. That Rabocea Diello did none of these things is well known. We shall have occasion below to deal with this well-known fact in detail and from various aspects. At the moment, however, we desire merely to show the glaring contradiction that exists between the demand for, quote, freedom of criticism and the specific features of our native criticism and Russian economism. It suffices but to glance at the text of the resolution in which the Union of Russian Social Democrats Abroad endorsed the point of view of Rabocea Diello. Quote, "In the interests of the further ideological development of social democracy, we recognize the freedom of criticism of social democratic theory and party literature to be absolutely necessary insofar as the criticism does not run counter to the class and revolutionary character of this theory." Unquote. And the motivation? The resolution, quote, in its first part coincides with the resolution of the Lubeck Party Congress on Bernstein. In the simplicity of their souls, the Unionists failed to observe what a testimonium pauperatis, attestation of poverty, they betray with this copying. But, in its second part, it restricts freedom of criticism much more than did the Lubeck Party Congress. The resolution of the Union abroad, then, is directed against the Russian Bernsteinians? If it is not, then the reference to Lubeck would be utterly absurd. But it is not true to say that it restricts freedom of criticism. In adopting their Hanover Resolution, the Germans, point by point, rejected precisely the amendments proposed by Bernstein, while in their Lubeck Resolution they cautioned Bernstein personally by naming him. Our free imitators, however, make not a single allusion to a single manifestation of specifically Russian criticism and Russian economism. In view of this omission, the bare reference to the class and revolutionary character of the theory leaves far wider scope for misinterpretation, particularly when the Union abroad refuses to identify, quote, so-called economism with opportunism. But all this in passing. The main thing to note is that the positions of the opportunists in relation to the revolutionary social democrats in Russia are diametrically opposed to those in Germany. In that country, as we know, the revolutionary social democrats are in favor of preserving that which exists, the old program and the tactics, which are universally known and have been elucidated in all their details by many decades of experience. But the critics desire to introduce changes, and since these critics represent an insignificant minority, and since they are very timid in their revisionist efforts, one can understand the motives of the majority in confining themselves to their dry rejection of innovations. In Russia, however, it is the critics and the economists who are in favor of preserving that which exists. The critics want us to go on regarding them as Marxists and to guarantee them the freedom of criticism they enjoyed to the full, for in fact, they never recognized any kind of party ties. And moreover, we never had a generally recognized party body that could restrict freedom of criticism, if only by counsel. The economists want the revolutionaries to recognize the sovereign character of the present moment, as said in Rабочее Дело number 10, i.e. to recognize the, quote, legitimacy of that which exists. They want the, quote, ideologists not to try to, quote, divert the movement from the path that, quote, is determined by the interaction of material elements and material environment. They want to have that struggle recognized as desirable, quote, which it is possible for the workers to wage under the present conditions, and as the only possible struggle, that, quote, which they are actually waging at the present time. We revolutionary social democrats, on the contrary, are dissatisfied with this worship of spontaneity, i.e. of that which exists at the present moment. We demand that the tactics that have prevailed in recent years be changed. We declare that, quote, before we can unite, and in order that we may unite, we must first of all draw firm and definite lines of demarcation. In a word, the Germans stand for that which exists and reject changes. We demand a change of that which exists and reject subservience thereto and reconciliation to it. This, quote, slight difference our, quote, free copyists of German resolutions failed to notice. And a quick comment from S4A, that was the end of section 1.3. Lenin has used the term economism here a lot, and there is kind of an explanation of that, but if you're confused about economism, it is less a revolutionary aim and more just the struggle for, like a trade unionist struggle for just better wages and sort of, limited thinking improvements of job conditions rather than a revolutionary socialist worldview. Just, particular things that you can lobby for on a shop floor in terms of hours and conditions and pay and safety and things like that. If you're interested in an example of a labor union that wasn't purely economist in its thinking, the IWW of the early days, it was founded actually right around this time in 1905. Industrial Workers of the World, or Wobblies as they were called, is a labor union that did fight for day-to-day short-term gains like better hours and pay, but they also had in mind the overthrow of capitalism and a cooperative economy. So, you know, there's nothing that says labor unions have to be purely economists, so hence the attacks here. All right, so back to the text, section 1.4, Engels on the importance of the theoretical struggle. Dogmatism, doctrinarism, ossification of the party, the inevitable retribution that follows the violent straight-lacing of thought. These are the enemies against which the knightly champions of freedom of criticism in Rабочее дело rise up in arms. We are very glad that this question has been placed on the order of the day, and we would only propose to add it to one other. And who are the judges? We have before us two publishers' announcements. One, the program of the periodical organ of the Union of Russian Social Democrats Abroad, Рабочее дело, and the other, the announcement of the resumption of the publications of the Emancipation of Labor Group. Both are dated 1899, when the crisis of Marxism had long been under discussion. And what do we find? We would seek in vain in the first announcement for any reference to this phenomenon, or a definite statement of the position the new organ intends to adopt on this question. Not a word is said about theoretical work and the urgent tasks that now confront it, either in this program or in the supplements to it that were adopted by the Third Congress of the Union Abroad in 1901. During this entire time, the editorial board of Рабочее дело ignored theoretical questions, in spite of the fact that these were questions that disturbed the minds of all social democrats the world over. The other announcement, on the contrary, points first of all to the declining interest in theory in recent years, imperatively demands, quote, vigilant attention to the theoretical aspect of the revolutionary movement of the proletariat, and calls for, quote, ruthless criticism of the Bernsteinian and other anti-revolutionary tendencies in our movement. The issues of Zarya to date show how this program has been carried out. Thus, we see that high-sounding phrases against the ossification of thought, etc., conceal unconcern and helplessness with regard to the development of theoretical thought. The case of the Russian Social Democrats manifestly illustrates the general European phenomenon, long ago noted also by the German Marxists, that the much vaunted freedom of criticism does not imply substitution of one theory for another, but freedom from all integral and pondered theory. It implies eclecticism and lack of principle. Those who have the slightest acquaintance with the actual state of our movement cannot but see that the widespread of Marxism was accompanied by a certain lowering of the theoretical level. Quite a number of people with very little and even a total lack of theoretical training joined the movement because of its practical significance and its practical successes. We can judge from that how tactless Рабочее дело is when, with an air of triumph, it quotes Marx's statement, quote, every step of real movement is more important than a dozen programs. To repeat these words in a period of theoretical disorder is like wishing mourners at a funeral many happy returns of the day. Moreover, these words of Marx are taken from his letter on the Gotha program, in which he sharply condemns eclecticism in the formulation of principles. If you must unite, Marx wrote to the party leaders, then enter into agreements to satisfy the practical aims of the movement, but do not allow any bargaining over principles. Do not make theoretical concessions. This was Marx's idea, and yet there are people amongst us who seek in his name to belittle the significance of theory. Without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. This idea cannot be insisted upon too strongly at a time when the fashionable preaching of opportunism goes hand in hand with an infatuation for the narrowest forms of practical activity. Yet, for Russian Social Democrats, the importance of theory is enhanced by three other circumstances which are often forgotten. First, by the fact that our party is only in process of formation. Its features are only just becoming defined, and it has as yet far from settled accounts with the other trends of revolutionary thought that threaten to divert the movement from the correct path. On the contrary, precisely the very recent past was marked by a revival of non-social democratic revolutionary trends, an eventuation regarding which Axelrod long ago warned the economists. Under these circumstances, what at first sight appears to be an unimportant error may lead to most deplorable consequences, and only short-sighted people can consider factional disputes and a strict differentiation between shades of opinion inopportune or superfluous. The fate of Russian social democracy for very many years to come may depend on the strengthening of one or the other shade. Secondly, the social democratic movement is in its very essence an international movement. This means not only that we must combat national chauvinism, but that an incipient movement in a young country can be successful only if it makes use of the experiences of other countries. In order to make use of these experiences, it is not enough merely to be acquainted with them, or simply to copy out the latest resolutions. What is required is the ability to treat these experiences critically and to test them independently. He who realizes how enormously the modern working class movement has grown and branched out will understand what a reserve of theoretical forces and political, as well as revolutionary, experience is required to carry out this task. Thirdly, the national tasks of Russian social democracy are such as have never confronted any other socialist party in the world. We shall have occasion further on to deal with the political and organizational duties which the task of emancipating the whole people from the yoke of autocracy imposes upon us. At this point, we wish to state only that the role of vanguard fighter can be fulfilled only by a party that is guided by the most advanced theory. To have a concrete understanding of what this means, let the reader recall such predecessors of Russian social democracy as Herzen, Belinsky, Chernyshevsky, and the brilliant galaxy of revolutionaries of the 70s. Let him ponder over the world significance which Russian literature is now acquiring. Let him, but be that enough? Let us quote what Engels said in 1874 concerning the significance of theory in the social democratic movement. Engels recognizes not two forms of the great struggle of social democracy, political and economic, as is the fashion among us, but three, placing the theoretical struggle on a par with the first two. His recommendations to the German working class movement, which had become strong, practically and politically, are so instructive from the standpoint of present-day problems and controversies that we hope the reader will not be vexed with us for quoting a long passage from his prefatory note to Der Deutsche Bauernkrieg, which has long become a great bibliographical rarity. Quote, "The German workers have two important advantages over those of the rest of Europe. First, they belong to the most theoretical people of Europe, and they have retained that sense of theory which the so-called educated classes of Germany have almost completely lost. Without German philosophy, which preceded it, particularly that of Hegel, German scientific socialism, the only scientific socialism that has ever existed, would never have come into being. Without a sense of theory among the workers, this scientific socialism would never have entered their flesh and blood as much as is the case. What an immeasurable advantage this is may be seen, on the one hand, from the indifference towards all theory, which is one of the main reasons why the English working class movement crawls along so slowly in spite of the splendid organization of the individual unions. On the other hand, from the mischief and confusion wrought by Proudhonism in its original form among the French and Belgians, and in the form further caricatured by Bakunin under the Spaniards and Italians. The second advantage is that, chronologically speaking, the Germans were about the last to come into the workers' movement. Just as German theoretical socialism will never forget that it rests on the soldiers of Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen, three men who, in spite of all their fantastic notions and all their utopianism, have their place among the most eminent thinkers of all times, and whose genius anticipated innumerable things, the correctness of which is now being scientifically proved by us. So the practical workers' movement in Germany ought never to forget that it has developed on the shoulders of the English and French movements, that it was able simply to utilize their dearly bought experience and could now avoid their mistakes, which in their time were mostly unavoidable. Without the precedent of the English trade unions and French workers' political struggles, without the gigantic impulse given especially by the Paris Commune, where would we be now? It must be said to the credit of the German workers that they have exploited the advantages of their situation with rare understanding. For the first time since a workers' movement has existed, the struggle is being conducted pursuant to its three sides: the theoretical, the political, and the practical economic, resistance to the capitalists, in harmony and in its interconnections, and in a systemic way. It is precisely in this, as it were, concentric attack that the strength and invincibility of the German movement lies. Due to this advantageous situation on the one hand, and to the insular peculiarities of the English and the forcible suppression of the French movement on the other, the German workers have for the moment been placed in the vanguard of the proletarian struggle. How long events will allow them to occupy this post of honor cannot be foretold, but let us hope that as long as they do occupy it, they will fill it fittingly. This demands redoubled efforts in every field of struggle and agitation. In particular, it will be the duty of the leaders to gain an ever clearer insight into all theoretical questions, to free themselves more and more from the influence of traditional phrases inherited from the old world outlook, and constantly to keep in mind that socialism, since it has become a science, demands that it be pursued as a science, i.e. that it be studied. The task will be to spread with increased zeal among the masses of the workers the ever more clarified understanding thus acquired, to knit together ever more firmly the organization both of the party and of the trade unions. If the German workers progress in this way, they will not be marching exactly at the head of the movement. It is not at all in the interest of this movement that the workers of any particular country should march at its head, but they will occupy an honorable place in the battle line, and they will stand armed for battle when either unexpectedly grave trials or momentous events demand of them increased courage, increased determination and energy. That's ending the quote from Engels. Back to Lenin. Engels' words proved prophetic. Within a few years, the German workers were subjected to unexpectedly grave trials in the form of the exceptional law against the socialists. And they met those trials armed for battle and succeeded in emerging from them victorious. The Russian proletariat will have to undergo trials immeasurably graver. It will have to fight a monster compared with which an anti-socialist law in a constitutional country seems but a dwarf. History has now confronted us with an immediate task which is the most revolutionary of all the immediate tasks confronting the proletariat of any country. The fulfillment of this task, the destruction of the most powerful bulwark, not only of European, but it may now be said of Asiatic reaction, would make the Russian proletariat the vanguard of the international revolutionary proletariat. And we have the right to count upon acquiring this honorable title, already earned by our predecessors, the revolutionaries of the 70s, if we succeed in inspiring our movement, which is 1,000 times broader and deeper, with the same devoted determination and vigor. Chapter 2, the spontaneity of the masses and the consciousness of the Social Democrats. We have said that our movement, much more extensive and deep than the movement of the 70s, must be inspired with the same devoted determination and energy that inspired the movement at that time. Indeed, no one, we think, has until now doubted that the strength of the present-day movement lies in the awakening of the masses, principally the industrial proletariat, and that its weaknesses lie in the lack of consciousness and initiative among the revolutionary leaders. However, of late, a staggering discovery has been made, which threatens to disestablish all hitherto prevailing views on this question. This discovery was made by Rabotchaya Dielo, which in its polemic with Iskra and Zarya did not confine itself to making objections on separate points, but tried to ascribe, quote, general disagreements to a more profound cause, to the, quote, different appraisals of the relative importance of the spontaneous and consciously methodical element. Rabotchaya Dielo formulated its indictment as a, quote, belittling of the significance of the objective or the spontaneous element of development. To this we say, had the polemics with Iskra and Zarya resulted in nothing more than causing Rabotchaya Dielo to hit upon these, quote, general disagreements, that alone would give us considerable satisfaction. So significant is this thesis, and so clear is the light it sheds on the quintessence of the present-day theoretical and political differences that exist among Russian social democrats. For this reason, the question of the relation between consciousness and spontaneity is of such enormous general interest, and for this reason the question must be dealt with in great detail. Section 2.1, the beginning of the spontaneous upsurge. In the previous chapter, we pointed out how universally absorbed the educated youth of Russia was in the theories of Marxism in the middle of the 90s. In the same period, the strikes that followed the famous St. Petersburg Industrial War of 1896 assumed a similar general character. Their spread over the whole of Russia clearly showed the depth of the newly awakening popular movement. And if we are to speak of the, quote, spontaneous element, then of course it is this strike movement which, first and foremost, must be regarded as spontaneous. But there is spontaneity and spontaneity. Strikes occurred in Russia in the 70s and 60s, and even in the first half of the 19th century, and they were accompanied by the spontaneous destruction of machinery, etc. Compared with these revolts, the strikes of the 90s might even be described as conscious. To such an extent do they mark the progress which the working class movement made in that period. This shows that the, quote, spontaneous element, in essence, represents nothing more nor less than consciousness in an embryonic form. Even the primitive revolts expressed the awakening of consciousness to a certain extent. The workers were losing their age-long faith in the permanence of the system which oppressed them and began, I shall not say to understand, but to sense the necessity for collective resistance, definitely abandoning their slavish submission to the authorities. But this was, nevertheless, more in the nature of outbursts of desperation and vengeance than of struggle. The strikes of the 90s revealed far greater flashes of consciousness. Definite demands were advanced, the strike was carefully timed, known cases and instances in other places were discussed, etc. The revolts were simply the resistance of the oppressed, whereas the systematic strikes represented the class struggle in embryo, but only in embryo. Taken by themselves, these strikes were simply trade union struggles, not yet social democratic struggles. They marked the awakening antagonisms between workers and employers, but the workers were not and could not be conscious of the irreconcilable antagonism of their interests to the whole of the modern political and social system, i.e., theirs was not yet social democratic consciousness. In this sense, the strikes of the 90s, despite the enormous progress they represented as compared with the revolts, remained a purely spontaneous movement. We have said that there could not have been social democratic consciousness among the workers. It would have to be brought to them from without. The history of all countries shows that the working class, exclusively by its own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness, i.e., the conviction that it is necessary to combine in unions, fight the employers, and strive to compel the government to pass necessary labor legislation, etc. The theory of socialism, however, grew out of the philosophic, historical, and economic theories elaborated by educated representatives of the propertied classes, by intellectuals. By their social status, the founders of modern scientific socialism, Marx and Engels, themselves belonged to the bourgeois intelligentsia. In the very same way, in Russia, the theoretical doctrine of social democracy arose altogether independently of the spontaneous growth of the working class movement. It arose as a natural and inevitable outcome of the development of thought among the revolutionary socialist intelligentsia. In the period under discussion, the middle 90s, this doctrine not only represented the completely formulated program of the Emancipation of Labor group, but had already won over to its side the majority of the revolutionary youth in Russia. Hence, we had both the spontaneous awakening of the working masses, their awakening to conscious life and conscious struggle, and a revolutionary youth armed with social democratic theory and straining towards the workers. In this connection, it is particularly important to state the oft-forgotten and comparatively little-known fact that although the early social democrats of that period zealously carried on economic agitation, being guided in this activity by the truly useful indications contained in the pamphlet on agitation, then still in manuscript, they did not regard this as their sole task. On the contrary, from the very beginning, they set for Russian social democracy the most far-reaching historical tasks in general, and the task of overthrowing the autocracy in particular. Thus, toward the end of 1895, the St. Petersburg group of Social Democrats, which founded the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class, prepared the first issue of a newspaper called Robochia Dielo. This issue was ready to go to press when it was seized by the gendarmes on the night of December 8, 1895, in a raid on the house of one of the members of the group, Anatoly Alexievich Vaneyey, V-A-N-E-Y-E-Y, so that the first edition of Robochia Dielo was not destined to see the light of day. The leading article in this issue, which perhaps 30 years hence some Ruskaya Starina will unearth in the archives of the Department of Police, outlined the historical tasks of the working class in Russia and placed the achievement of political liberty at their head. The issue also contained an article entitled, "What Are Our Ministers Thinking About?", which dealt with the crushing of the elementary education committees by the police. In addition, there was some correspondence from St. Petersburg and from other parts of Russia, e.g. a letter on the massacre of the workers in Yaroslavl Gubernia. This first effort, if we are not mistaken, of the Russian Social Democrats of the 90s, was not a purely local, or less still economic newspaper, but one that aimed to unite the strike movement with the revolutionary movement against the autocracy, and to win over to the side of social democracy all who were oppressed by the policy of reactionary obscurantism. No one in the slightest degree acquainted with the state of the movement at that period could doubt that such a paper would have met with warm response among the workers of the capital and the revolutionary intelligentsia, and would have had a wide circulation. The failure of the enterprise merely showed that the Social Democrats of that period were unable to meet the immediate requirements of the time, owing to their lack of revolutionary experience and practical training. This must be said too with regard to the Petersburgsky Robochi Listok, and particularly with regard to Robochia Gazeta and the manifesto of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party founded in the spring of 1898. Of course, we would not dream of blaming the Social Democrats of that time for this unpreparedness. But in order to profit from the experience of that movement and to draw practical lessons from it, we must thoroughly understand the causes and significance of this or that shortcoming. It is therefore highly important to establish the fact that a part, or perhaps even a majority, of the Social Democrats active in the period of 1895 to 98 justly considered it possible even then, at the very beginning of the spontaneous movement, to come forward with the most extensive program and a militant tactical line. Lack of training of the majority of the revolutionaries, an entirely natural phenomenon, could not have roused any particular fears. Once the tasks were correctly defined, once the energy existed for repeated attempts to fulfill them, temporary failures represented only part misfortune. Revolutionary experience and organizational skill are things that can be acquired, provided the desire is there to acquire them, provided the shortcomings are recognized, in which revolutionary activity is more than halfway towards their removal. But what was only part misfortune became full misfortune when this consciousness began to grow dim. It was very much alive among the members of the groups mentioned. When there appeared people, and even social democratic organs, that were prepared to regard shortcomings as virtues, that even tried to invent a theoretical basis for their slavish cringing before spontaneity. It is time to draw conclusions from this trend, the content of which is incorrectly and too narrowly characterized as economism. Section 2.2, Bowing to Spontaneity, Robochia Missile. Before dealing with the literary manifestation of this subservience to spontaneity, we should like to note the following characteristic fact, communicated to us from the above-mentioned source, which throws light on the conditions in which the two future conflicting trends in Russian social democracy arose and grew among the comrades working in St. Petersburg. In the beginning of 1897, just prior to their banishment, A.A. Vaneyev and several of his comrades attended a private meeting at which old and young members of the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of Working Class gathered. The conversation centered chiefly about the question of organization, particularly about the rules for the Workers' Mutual Benefit Fund, which, in their final form, were published in Listok Robotnika, number 9 through 10. Sharp differences immediately showed themselves between the old members, Decembrists as the St. Petersburg Social Democrats jestingly called them, and several young members, who subsequently took an active part in the work of Rabotchia Missal, with a heated discussion ensuing. The young members defended the main principles of the rules in the form in which they were published. The old members contended that the prime necessity was not this, but the consolidation of the League of Struggle into an organization of revolutionaries, to which all the various workers' mutual benefit funds, students' propaganda circles, etc. should be subordinated. It goes without saying that the disputing sides far from realized at the time that these disagreements were the beginning of a cleavage. On the contrary, they regarded them as something isolated and casual. But this fact shows that in Russia, too, economism did not arise and spread without a struggle against the old social democrats, which the economists of today are apt to forget. And if, in the main, this struggle has not left documentary traces behind it, it is solely because the membership of the circles then functioning underwent such constant change that no continuity was established, and consequently differences in points of view were not recorded in any documents. The founding of Rabotchia Missal brought economism to the light of day, but not at one stroke. We must picture to ourselves concretely the conditions for activity and the short-lived character of the majority of the Russian study circles, a thing that is possible only for those who have themselves experienced it, in order to understand how much there was of the fortuitous in the successes and failures of the new trend in various towns, and the length of time during which neither the advocates nor the opponents of the, quote, new could make up their minds, and literally had no opportunity of so doing, as to whether this really expressed a distinct trend or merely the lack of training of certain individuals. For example, the first mimeographed copies of Rabotchia Missal never reached the great majority of social democrats, and if we are able to refer to the leading article in the first number, it is only because it was reproduced in an article by V.I., who, of course, did not fail to extol with more zeal than reason the new paper, which was so different from the papers and projects for papers mentioned above. It is well worth dwelling on this leading article because it brings out in bold relief the entire spirit of Rabotchia Missal and economism generally. After stating that the arm of the, quote, bluecoats could never halt the progress of the working class movement, the leading article goes on to say, quote, the virility of the working class movement is due to the fact that the workers themselves are at last taking their fate into their own hands and out of the hands of the leaders. This fundamental crisis is then developed in greater detail. Actually, the leaders, i.e. the Social Democrats, the organizers of the League of Struggle, were, one might say, torn out of the hands of the workers by the police. Yet it is made to appear that the workers were fighting against the leaders and liberated themselves from their yoke. Instead of sounding the call to go forward towards the consolidation of the revolutionary organization and the expansion of political activity, the call was issued for a retreat to the purely trade union struggle. It was announced that, quote, the economic basis of the movement is eclipsed by the effort never to forget the political ideal, unquote, and that the watchword for the working class movement was struggle for economic conditions, or better still, the workers for the workers. It was declared that strike funds, quote, are more valuable to the movement than 100 other organizations. Compare this statement made in October 1897 with the polemic between the Decembrists and the young members in the beginning of 1897, etc. Catch words like, we must concentrate not on the cream of the workers, but on the average mass worker. Politics always obediently follows economics, etc., became the fashion, exercising an irresistible influence upon the masses of the youth who were attracted to the movement, but who, in the majority of cases, were acquainted only with such fragments of Marxism as were expounded in legally appearing publications. Political consciousness was completely overwhelmed by spontaneity, the spontaneity of the Social Democrats who repeated Mr. VV's ideas, the spontaneity of those workers who were carried away by the arguments that a kopeck added to a ruble was worth more than any socialism or politics, and that they must, quote, fight knowing that they are fighting not for the sake of some future generation, but for themselves and their children, unquote. Phrases like these have always been a favorite weapon of the West European bourgeois, who, in their hatred for socialism, strove, like the German Sozialpolitiker Hirsch, to transplant English trade unionism to their native soil and to preach to the workers that by engaging in the purely trade union struggle, they would be fighting for themselves and for their children and not for some future generations with some future socialism. And now the VVs of Russian social democracy have set about repeating these bourgeois phrases. It is important at this point to note three circumstances that will be useful to our further analysis of contemporary differences. In the first place, the overwhelming of political consciousness by spontaneity, to which we referred above, also took place spontaneously. This may sound like a pun, but alas, it is the bitter truth. It did not take place as the result of an open struggle between two diametrically opposed points of view in which one triumphed over the other. It occurred because of the fact that an increasing number of old revolutionaries were torn away by the gendarmes and increasing number of young VVs of Russian social democracy appeared on the scene. Everyone who has, I shall not say participated in, but at least breathed the atmosphere of the present-day Russian movement, knows perfectly well that this is precisely the case. And if, nevertheless, we insist strongly that the reader be fully clear on this generally known fact, if we cite, for explicitness, as it were, the facts of the first edition of Рабочее Дело and of the polemic between the old and the young at the beginning of 1897, we do this because the people who vaunt their democracy speculate on the ignorance of these facts on the part of the broad public, or of the very young generation. We shall return to this point further on. Secondly, in the very first literary expression of economism, we observe the exceedingly curious phenomenon, highly characteristic for an understanding of all the differences prevailing among present-day social democrats, that the adherents of the, quote, labor movement pure and simple, worshippers of the closest, quote, organic contacts, Рабочее Дело's term, with the proletarian struggle, opponents of any non-worker intelligentsia, even a socialist intelligentsia, are compelled, in order to defend their positions, to resort to the arguments of the bourgeois, quote, pure trade unionists. This shows that from the very outset, Рабочая Мысль began unconsciously to implement the program of the Credo. This shows something Рабочее Дело cannot grasp, that all worship of the spontaneity of the working class movement, all belittling of the role of the conscious element, of the role of social democracy, means, quite independently of whether he who belittles that role desires it or not, a strengthening of the influence of bourgeois ideology upon the workers. All those who talk about, quote, overrating the importance of ideology, about exaggerating the role of the conscious element, etc., imagine that the labor movement, pure and simple, can elaborate and will elaborate an independent ideology for itself if only the workers, quote, wrest their fate from the hands of the leaders. But this is a profound mistake. To supplant what has been said above, we shall quote the following profoundly true and important words of Karl Kautsky on the new draft program of the Austrian Social Democratic Party. Quote, many of our revisionist critics believe that Marx asserted that economic development and the class struggle create not only the conditions for socialist production, but also, and directly, the consciousness of its necessity. And these critics assert that England, the country most highly developed capitalistically, is more remote than any other from this consciousness. Judging by the draft, one might assume that this allegedly orthodox Marxist view, which is thus refuted, was shared by the committee that drafted the Austrian program. In the draft program, it is stated, quote, the more capitalist development increases the numbers of the proletariat, the more the proletariat is compelled and becomes fit to fight against capitalism. The proletariat becomes conscious of the possibility and of the necessity for socialism. In this connection, socialist consciousness appears to be a necessary and direct result of the proletarian class struggle. But this is absolutely untrue. Of course, socialism as a doctrine has its roots in modern economic relationships, just as the class struggle of the proletariat has, and, like the latter, emerges from the struggle against the capitalist-created poverty and misery of the masses. But socialism and the class struggle arise side by side and not one out of the other. Each arises under different conditions. Modern socialist consciousness can arise only on the basis of profound scientific knowledge. Indeed, modern economic science is as much a condition for socialist production as, say, modern technology, and the proletariat can create neither the one nor the other, no matter how much it may desire to do so. Both arise out of the modern social process. The vehicle of science is not the proletariat, but the bourgeois intelligentsia. It was in the minds of individual members of this stratum that modern socialism originated, and it was they who communicated it to the more intellectually developed proletarians, who, in their turn, introduce it to the proletarian class struggle where conditions allow that to be done. Thus, socialist consciousness is something introduced into the proletarian class struggle from without, and not something that arose within it spontaneously. Accordingly, the old Hainfield program quite rightly stated that the task of social democracy is to imbue the proletariat, literally saturate the proletariat, with the consciousness of its position and the consciousness of its task. There would be no need for this if consciousness arose of itself from the class struggle. The new draft copied this proposition from the old program and attached it to the proposition mentioned above. But this completely broke the line of thought, unquote. Since there can be no talk of an independent ideology formulated by the working masses themselves in the process of their movement, the only choice is either bourgeois or socialist ideology. There is no middle course, for mankind has not created a third ideology, and, moreover, in a society torn by class antagonisms, there can never be a non-class or an above-class ideology. Hence, to belittle the socialist ideology in any way, to turn aside from it in the slightest degree, means to strengthen bourgeois ideology. There is much talk of spontaneity, but the spontaneous development of the working class movement leads to its subordination to bourgeois ideology, to its development along the lines of the Credo program. For the spontaneous working class movement is trade unionism, is nur Gewerkschaftlerei, and trade unionism means the ideological enslavement of the workers by the bourgeoisie. Hence, our task, the task of social democracy, is to combat spontaneity, to divert the working class movement from this spontaneous trade unionist striving to come under the wing of the bourgeoisie, and to bring it under the wing of revolutionary social democracy. The sentence employed by the authors of the Economist letter published in Iskra number 12, that the efforts of the most inspired ideologists fail to divert the working class movement from the path that is determined by the interaction of the material elements and the material environment, is therefore tantamount to renouncing socialism. If these authors were capable of fearlessly, consistently, and thoroughly considering what they say, as everyone who enters the arena of literary and public activity should be, there would be nothing left for them but to, quote, fold their useless arms over their empty breasts and surrender the field of action to the Struves and the Prokopoviches, who are dragging the working class movement, quote, along the line of least resistance, i.e., along the line of bourgeois trade unionism, or to the Zubatovs, who are dragging it along the line of clerical and gendarme, quote, ideology. Let us recall the example of Germany. What was the historic service Lassalle rendered to the German working class movement? It was that he diverted that movement from the path of progressionist trade unionism and cooperativism, toward which it had been spontaneously moving, with the benign assistance of Schulze Delitzsch and his like. To fulfill such a task, it was necessary to do something quite different from talking of underrating the spontaneous element, of tactics as process, of the interaction between elements and environment, etc. A fierce struggle against spontaneity was necessary, and only after such a struggle, extending over many years, was it possible, for instance, to convert the working population of Berlin from a bulwark of the Progressionist Party into one of the finest strongholds of social democracy. This struggle is by no means over even today, as might seem to those who learn the history of the German movement from Prokopovich and its philosophy from Struve. Even now, the German working class is, so to speak, split up among a number of ideologies. A section of the workers is organized in Catholic and monarchist trade unions. Another section is organized in the Hirsch-Dürcker unions, founded by the bourgeois worshippers of English trade unionism. The third is organized in social democratic trade unions. The last named group is immeasurably more numerous than the rest, but the social democratic ideology was able to achieve this superiority and will be able to maintain it only in an unswerving struggle against all other ideologies. But why, the reader will ask, does the spontaneous movement, the movement along the line of least resistance, lead to the domination of bourgeois ideology? For the simple reason that bourgeois ideology is far older in origin than socialist ideology, that it is more fully developed, and that it has at its disposal immeasurably more means of dissemination. And the younger the socialist movement in any given country, the more vigorously it must struggle against all attempts to entrench non-socialist ideology, and the more resolutely the workers must be warned against the bad counselors who shout against, quote, overrating the conscious element, etc. The authors of The Economist letter, in union with Robochia Diello, inveigh against the intolerance that is characteristic of the infancy of the movement. To this we reply, yes, our movement is indeed in its infancy, and in order that it may grow up faster, it must become imbued with intolerance against those who retard its growth by their subservience to spontaneity. Nothing is so ridiculous and so harmful as pretending that we are, quote, old hands who have long ago experienced all the decisive stages of the struggle. Thirdly, the first issue of Robochia Missal shows that the term economism, which of course we do not propose to abandon since in one way or another this designation has already established itself, does not adequately convey the real character of the new trend. Robochia Missal does not altogether repudiate the political struggle. The rules for a workers' mutual benefit fund published in its first issue contain a reference to combating the government. Robochia Missal believes, however, that, quote, politics always obediently follows economics. Robochia Diello varies this thesis when it asserts in its program that, quote, in Russia more than in any other country, the economic struggle is inseparable from the political struggle. If by politics is meant social democratic politics, then the theses of Robochia Missal and Robochia Diello are utterly incorrect. The economic struggle of the workers is very often connected, though not inseparably, with bourgeois politics, clerical politics, etc., as we have seen. Robochia Diello's theses are correct if by politics is meant trade union politics, vis-a-vis the common striving of all workers to secure from the government measures for alleviating the distress to which their conditions give rise, but which do not abolish that condition, i.e. which do not remove the subjection of labor to capital. That striving, indeed, is common to the English trade unionists, who are hostile to socialism, to the Catholic workers, to the Zubetov workers, etc. There is politics and politics. Thus we see that the Robochia Missal does not so much deny the political struggle as it bows to its spontaneity, to its unconsciousness. While fully recognizing the political struggle, better, the political desires and demands of the workers, which arises spontaneously from the working class movement itself, it absolutely refuses independently to work out a specifically social democratic politics corresponding to the general tasks of socialism and to present-day conditions in Russia. Further on, we shall show that Robochia Diello commits the same error. Section 2.3, the self-emancipation group and Robochia Diello. We have dealt at such length with the little-known and now almost forgotten leading article in the first issue of Robochia Missal, because it was the first and most striking expression of that general stream of thought which afterwards emerged into the light of day in innumerable streamlets. VI was perfectly right when, in praising the first issue and the leading article of Robochia Missal, he said that the article had been written in a, quote, sharp and fervent manner. Every man with convictions who thinks he has something new to say writes fervently, and in such a way as to make his views stand out in bold relief. Only those who are accustomed to sitting between two stools lack fervor. Only such people are able to praise the fervor of Rabotchia Missile one day and attack the fervent polemics of its opponents the next. We shall not dwell on the separate supplement to Rabotchia Missile. Below we shall have occasion on various points to refer to this work, which expresses the ideas of the economists more consistently than any other, but shall briefly mention the Appeal of the Self-Emancipation of the Workers Group from March 1899. The authors of this appeal rightly say that, quote, the workers of Russia are only just awakening, are just beginning to look about them, and are instinctively clutching at the first available means of struggle, unquote. Yet they draw from this the same false conclusion as that drawn by Rabotchia Missile, forgetting that the instinctive is the unconscious, the spontaneous, to the aid of which socialists must come, that the, quote, first available means of struggle will always be, in modern society, the trade union means of struggle, and the, quote, first available ideology, the bourgeois trade union ideology. Similarly, these authors do not repudiate politics, they merely echo Mr. V.V. that politics is the superstructure, and therefore, quote, political agitation must be the superstructure to the agitation carried on in favor of the economic struggle. It must arise on the basis of this struggle and follow in its wake. As for Rabotchia-Diello, it began its activity with the defense of the economists. It stated a downright untruth in its opening issue in claiming that it, quote, does not know to which young comrades Axelrod referred, unquote, when he warned the economists in his well-known pamphlet. In the polemic that flared up with Axelrod and Plenkinov over this untruth, Rabotchia-Diello had to admit that, quote, in form of perplexity, it sought to defend all the younger social democrats abroad from this unjust accusation, unquote, or in other words, the charge of narrowness leveled by Axelrod at the economists. In reality, this accusation was completely justified, and Rabotchia-Diello knew perfectly well that, among others, it applied also to VI, a member of its editorial board. Let me note in passing that in this polemic, Axelrod was entirely right and Rabotchia-Diello entirely wrong in their respective interpretations of my pamphlet, The Tasks of the Russian Social Democrats. The pamphlet was written in 1897 before the appearance of Rabotchia Missile, when I thought rightly that the original tendency of the St. Petersburg League of Struggle, which I characterized above, was dominant. And this tendency was dominant at least until the middle of 1898. Consequently, Rabotchia-Diello had no right whatever in its attempt to deny the existence and danger of economism, to refer to a pamphlet that expressed views forced out by economist views in St. Petersburg in 1897 and 1898. But Rabotchia-Diello not only defended the economists, it itself constantly fell into their fundamental errors. The source of this confusion is to be found in the ambiguity of the interpretation given to the following thesis of the Rabotchia-Diello program. Quote, we consider that the most important phenomenon of Russian life, the one that will mainly determine the tasks and the character of the publication activity of the Union, is the mass working class movement, which has arisen in recent years, unquote. That the mass movement is a most important phenomenon is a fact not to be disputed. But the crux of the matter is, how is one to understand the statement that the mass working class movement will, quote, determine the tasks? It may be interpreted in one of two ways. Either it means bowing to the spontaneity of this movement, i.e. reducing the role of social democracy to mere subservience to the working class movement as such, the interpretation of Rabotchia Missile, the Self-Emancipation Group, and other economists. Or it means that the mass movement places before us new theoretical, political, and organizational tasks far more complicated than those that might have satisfied us in the period before the rise of the mass movement. Rabotchia-Diello inclined, and still inclines, toward the first interpretation, for it has said nothing definite about any new tasks. but has argued constantly as though the mass movement relieves us of the necessity of clearly understanding and fulfilling the tasks it sets before us. We need only point out that Robotnia Diallo considered that it was impossible to set the overthrow of the autocracy as the first task of the mass working class movement, and that it degraded this task in the name of the mass movement to that of a struggle for immediate political demands. We shall pass over the article by B. Khrushchevsky, editor of Robotnia Diallo, entitled The Economic and the Political Struggle in the Russian Movement, published in number 7 of that paper, in which these very mistakes are repeated, and proceed directly to Robotnia Diallo number 10. We shall not, of course, enter in detail into the various objections raised by Khrushchevsky and Martinov against Zara and Iskra. We are here interested solely in the basis of principles on which Robotnia Diallo in its 10th issue took its stand. Thus, we shall not examine the strange fact that Robotnia Diallo saw a, quote, diametrical contradiction between the proposition, quote, social democracy does not tie its hands, it does not restrict its activities to some one preconceived plan or method of political struggle. It recognizes all means of struggle as long as they correspond to the forces at the disposal of the party, etc. And the proposition, quote, without a strong organization skilled in waging political struggle under all circumstances and at all times, there can be no question of that systematic plan of action, illumined by firm principles and steadfastly carried out, which alone is worthy of the name of tactics. To confound recognition in principle of all means of struggle, of all plans and methods, provided they are expedient, with the demand at a given political moment to be guided by a strictly observed plan, is tantamount, if we are to talk of tactics, to confounding the recognition by medical science of various methods of treating diseases with the necessity for adopting a certain definite method of treatment for a given disease. The point is, however, that Robotnia Diallo, itself the victim of a disease which we have called bowing to spontaneity, refuses to recognize any method of treatment for that disease. Hence, it has made the remarkable discovery that, quote, tactics as plan contradicts the fundamental spirit of Marxism, unquote. That tactics are, quote, a process of growth of party tasks, which grow together with the party, unquote. This remark has every chance of becoming a celebrated maxim, a permanent monument to the Robotnia Diallo, quote, trend. To the question whither, the leading organ replies, movement is a process of changing the distance between the starting point and subsequent points of the movement. This matchless example of profundity is not merely a curiosity. Were it that, it would not be worth dealing with at length, but the program of a whole trend, the very program which RM, in the separate supplement to Robotnia Missile, expressed in the words, that struggle is desirable which is possible, and the struggle which is possible is that which is going on at the given moment. This is precisely the trend of unbounded opportunism, which passively adapts itself to spontaneity. Tactics as plan contradicts the essence of Marxism, but this is a slander of Marxism. It means turning Marxism into the caricature held up by the Narodniks in their struggle against us. It means belittling the initiative and energy of class-conscious fighters, whereas Marxism, on the contrary, gives a gigantic impetus to the initiative and energy of the social democrat, opens him up for the widest perspectives, and, if one may so express it, places at his disposal the mighty force of many millions of workers, quote, spontaneously rising for the struggle. The entire history of international social democracy teems with plans, advanced now by one, now by another political leader, some confirming the farsightedness and the correct political and organizational views of their authors, and others revealing their short-sightedness and their political errors. At the time when Germany was at one of the crucial turning points in its history, the formation of the empire, the opening of the Reichstag, and the granting of universal suffrage, Liebknecht had one plan for social democratic politics and work in general, and Schweitzer had another. When the anti-socialist law came down on the heads of the German socialists, Most and Hasselmann had one plan. They were prepared then and there to call for violence and terror. Hochberg, Schramm, and partly Bernstein had another. They began to preach to the Social Democrats that they themselves had provoked the enactment of the law by being unreasonably bitter and revolutionary, and must now earn forgiveness by their exemplary conduct. There was yet a third plan proposed by those who prepared and carried out the publication of an illegal organ. It is easy, of course, with hindsight, many years after the struggle over the selection of the path to be followed, and after history has pronounced its verdict as to the expediency of the path selected, to utter profound maxims about the growth of party tasks which grow together with the party. But at a time of confusion, when the Russian critics and economists are degrading social democracy to the level of trade unionism, and when the terrorists are strongly advocating the adoption of tactics as planned that repeats the old mistakes, at such a time to confine oneself to profundities of this kind means simply to issue to oneself a, quote, certificate of poverty. At a time when many Russian social democrats suffer from a lack of initiative and energy, from an inadequate, quote, scope of political propaganda, agitation, and organization, from a lack of plans for a broader organization of revolutionary work, at such a time to declare that tactics as planned contradicts the essence of Marxism means not only to vulgarize Marxism in the realm of theory, but to drag the party backward in practice. Rabotchia Diallo goes on to sermonize, quote, "The task of the revolutionary social democrat is only to accelerate objective developments by his conscious work, not to obviate it or substitute his own subjective plans for this development." Iskra knows all about this in theory, but the enormous importance which Marxism justly attaches to conscious revolutionary work causes it in practice, owing to its doctrinaire view of tactics, to belittle the significance of the objective or the spontaneous element of development, unquote. Another example of the extraordinary theoretical confusion worthy of Mr. VV and his fraternity. We would ask our philosopher, how may a designer of subjective plans, quote, belittle objective development? Obviously, by losing sight of the fact that this objective development creates or strengthens, destroys or weakens certain classes, strata, or groups, certain nations or groups of nations, etc., and in this way serves to determine a given international political alignment of forces or the position adopted by revolutionary parties, etc. If the designer of plans did that, his guilt would not be that he belittled the spontaneous element, but on the contrary, that he belittled the conscious element. For he would then show that he lacked the, quote, consciousness properly to understand objective development. Hence, the very talk of, quote, estimating the relative significance of spontaneity and consciousness itself reveals a complete lack of consciousness. If certain, quote, spontaneous elements of development can be grasped at all by human understanding, then an incorrect estimation of them will be tantamount to, quote, belittling the conscious element. But if they cannot be grasped, then we do not know them and therefore cannot speak of them. What then is Khrushchevsky discussing? If he thinks that Iskra's, quote, subjective plans are erroneous, as in fact he declares them to be, he should have shown what objective facts they ignore, and only then charge Iskra with lacking political consciousness for ignoring them, with, quote, belittling the conscious element, to use his own words. If, however, displeased with subjective plans, he can bring forward no argument other than that of, quote, belittling the spontaneous element, he merely shows, one, that theoretically he understands Marxism a la Karyev and Mikhailovsky, who have been sufficiently ridiculed by Beltov, and two, that practically he is quite satisfied with the, quote, spontaneous elements of development that have drawn our legal Marxists towards Bernsteinism and our social democrats towards economism, and that he is, quote, full of wrath against those who have determined at all costs to divert Russian social democracy from the path of, quote, spontaneous development.
I know, I was on chapter 6 before. Let me see.
To wipe out, quote, a dozen wise men or, quote, 100 fools, reduces itself to the question above considered, whether it is possible to have a mass organization.
And be right back, because we've been re-listening to this. Hold on. Okay. Okay, back to the workout.
Forms of work. Chapter 4. The Primitiveness of the Economists and the Organization of the Revolutionaries. Rabocciadiello's assertions, which we have analyzed, that the economic struggle is the most widely applicable means of political agitation, and that our task now is to lend the economic struggle itself a political character, etc., express a narrow view not only of our political, but also of our organizational tasks. The, quote, economic struggle against the employers and the government does not at all require an all-Russia centralized organization, and hence this struggle can never give rise to such an organization as will combine, in one general assault, all the manifestations of political opposition, protest, and indignation, an organization that will consist of professional revolutionaries and be led by the real political leaders of the entire people. This stands to reason. The character of any organization is naturally and inevitably determined by the content of its activity. Consequently, Rabocciadiello, by the assertions analyzed above, sanctifies and legitimizes not only narrowness of political activity, but also of organizational work. In this case, Rabocciadiello, as always, proves itself an organ whose consciousness yields to spontaneity. Yet subservience to spontaneously developing forms of organization, failure to realize the narrowness and primitiveness of our organizational work, of our, quote, in several
We had to have gotten to
traits
chapter
also
5.
into rules of order.
So we were just re-listening to that.
Who was offended by the article Where to Begin? Let us present a small selection of the expletives and exclamations that Rabocciadiello hurled at us. Quote, it is not a newspaper that can create a party organization, but vice versa. A newspaper standing above the party, outside of its control and independent of it, thanks to its having its own staff of agents. Quote, by what miracle has Iskra forgotten about the actually existing social democratic organizations of the party to which it belongs? Quote, those who possess firm principles and a corresponding plan are the supreme regulators of the real struggle of the party and dictate to it their plan. Quote, the plan drives our active and virile organizations into the kingdom of shadows and desires to call into being a fantastic network of agents. Quote, where Iskra's plan carried into effect, every trace of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party which has taken shape would be obliterated. Quote, a propagandist organ becomes an uncontrolled autocratic lawmaker for the entire practical revolutionary struggle. Quote, how should our party react to the suggestion that it be completely subordinated to an autonomous editorial board, etc., etc., etc. Quick comment from S4A. Reminds me a little bit of the Jimmy Dore forced the vote issue that came up last month with regard to a YouTube host, quote, dictating to the movement what to do. Identical indignation here. All right, coming back. As the reader can see from the contents and the tone of these above quotations, Rabocciadiello has taken offense. Offense, not for its own sake. Just commenting again, Rabocciadiello here might as well be like the Young Turks or something. Offense, not for its own sake, but for the sake of the organizations and committees of our party, which it alleges Iskra desires to drive into the kingdom of shadows, and whose very traces it would obliterate. How terrible! But a curious thing should be noted. The article Where to Begin appeared in May 1901. The articles in Rabocciadiello appeared in September 1901. Now we're in mid-January 1902. During these 5 months, prior to and after September, not a single committee and not a single organization of the party protested formally against this monster that seeks to drive them into the kingdom of shadows, and yet scores and hundreds of communications from all parts of Russia have appeared during this period in Iskra, as well as in numerous local and non-local publications. How could it happen that those who would be driven into the realm of shadows are not aware of it and have not taken offense although a third party has. The explanation is that the committees and other organizations are engaged in real work and are not playing at, quote, democracy. The committees read the article, where to begin, saw that it represented an attempt, quote, to elaborate a definite plan for an organization so that its formation may be undertaken from all aspects, unquote, and since they knew and saw very well that not one of these sides would dream of setting about to build it until it was convinced of its necessity and of the correctness of the architectural plan, it has naturally never occurred to them to take offense at the boldness of the people who said in Iskra, quote, in view of the pressing importance of the question, we, on our part, take the liberty of submitting to the comrades a skeleton plan to be developed in greater detail in a pamphlet now in preparation for the print, unquote. With a conscientious approach to the work, was it possible to view things otherwise than if the comrades accepted the plan submitted to them, they would carry it out, not because they are, quote, subordinate, but because they would be convinced of its necessity for our common cause, and that if they did not accept it, then the, quote, skeleton, a pretentious word, is it not, would remain merely a skeleton. Is it not demagogy to fight against the skeleton of a plan, not only by, quote, picking it to pieces and advising comrades to reject it, but by inciting people inexperienced in revolutionary matters against its authors, merely on the grounds that they dare to, quote, legislate and come out as the, quote, supreme regulators, i.e. because they dare to propose an outline of a plan? Can our party develop and make progress if an attempt to raise local functionaries to broader views, tasks, plans, etc. is objected to, not only with the claim that these views are erroneous, but on the grounds that the very, quote, desire to, quote, raise us gives, quote, offense? Nadezhdin, too, quote, picked our plan to pieces, but he did not sink to such demagogy as cannot be explained solely by naivete or by primitiveness of political views. From the outset, he emphatically rejected the charge that we intended to establish a, quote, inspectorship over the party. That is why Nadezhdin's criticism of the plan can and should be answered on its merits, while Rabotchia Diallo deserves only to be treated with contempt. But contempt for a writer who sinks so low as to shout about autocracy and subordination does not relieve us of the duty of disentangling the confusion that such people create in the minds of their readers. Here we can clearly demonstrate to the world the nature of catchwords like, quote, broad democracy. We are accused of forgetting the committees, of desiring or attempting to drive them into the kingdom of shadows, etc. How can we reply to these charges when, out of considerations of secrecy, we can give the reader almost no facts regarding our real relationships with the committees? Persons hurling vehement accusations calculated to provoke the crowd proved to be ahead of us because of their brazenness and their disregard of the duty of a revolutionary to conceal carefully from the eyes of the world the relationships and contacts which he remains, which he is establishing or trying to establish. Naturally, we refuse once and for all to compete with such people in the field of, quote, democratism. As to the reader who is not initiated in all party affairs, the only way in which we can discharge our duty to him is to acquaint him, not with what is and what is im verdun, but with a particle of what has taken place and what may be told as a thing of the past. The Bund hints that we are, quote, impostors. The Union abroad accuses us of attempting to obliterate all traces of the party. Gentlemen, you will get complete satisfaction when we relate to the public 4 facts concerning the past. First fact, the members of one of the leagues of struggle took a direct part in founding our party and in sending a delegate to the inaugural party congress, reached agreement with a member of the Iskra group regarding the publication of a series of books for workers that were to serve the entire movement. The attempt to publish the series failed, and the pamphlets written for it, The Tasks of the Russian Social Democrats and the New Factory Law, by a circuitous course and through the medium of third parties, found their way abroad where they were published. Second fact, members of the Central Committee of the Bund approached a member of the Iskra group with a proposal to organize what the Bund then described as a, quote, literary laboratory. In making the proposal, they stated that unless this was done, the movement would greatly retrogress. The result of these negotiations was the appearance of the pamphlet The Working Class Cause in Russia. Third fact, the Central Committee of the Bund, via a provincial town, approached a member of the Iskra group with the proposal that he undertake the editing of the revived Rabotchia Gazeta, and of course obtained his consent. The offer was later modified. The comrade in question was invited to act as a contributor in view of a new plan for the composition of the editorial board. Also, this proposal, of course, obtained his consent. Articles were sent, which we managed to preserve. Our program, which was a direct protest against Bernsteinism, against the change in the line of the legal literature and of Rabotchia Missal. Our immediate task, quote, to publish a party organ that shall appear regularly and have close contacts with all the local groups. The drawbacks of the prevailing amateurism. An urgent question, an examination of the objection that it is necessary first to develop the activities of local groups before undertaking the publication of a common organ, an insistence on the paramount importance of a, quote, revolutionary organization, and on the necessity of, quote, developing organization, discipline, and the technique of secrecy to the highest degree of perfection. The proposal to resume publication of Rabotchia Gazeta was not carried out, and the articles were not published. Fourth fact, a member of the committee that was organizing the second regular Congress of our party communicated to a member of the Iskra group the program of the Congress and proposed that group as editorial board of the revived Rabotchia Gazeta. This preliminary step, as it were, was later sanctioned by the committee to which this member belonged, and by the Central Committee of the Bund. The Iskra group was notified of the place and time of the Congress, and, uncertain of being able, for certain reasons, to send a delegate, drew up a written report for the Congress. In the report, the idea was suggested that the mere election of a Central Committee would not only fail to solve the question of unification at a time of such complete disorder as the present, but would even compromise the grand idea of establishing a party in the event of an early, swift, and thorough police roundup, which was more than likely in view of the prevailing lack of secrecy, that therefore a beginning should be made by inviting all committees and all other organizations to support the revived common organ, which would establish real contacts between all the committees and really train a group of leaders for the entire movement, and that the committees and the party would very easily be able to transform such a group into a central committee as soon as the group had grown and become strong. In consequence of a number of police raids and arrests, however, the Congress could not take place. For security reasons, the report was destroyed, having been read only by a few comrades, including the representatives of one committee. Let the reader now judge for himself the character of the methods employed by the Bund in hinting that we were impostors, or by Rabotchia Dielo, which accuses us of trying to relegate the committees to the kingdom to revive the central organ of the party had failed, did we consider it our bounden duty to publish an unofficial organ in order that with the third attempt, the comrades might have before them the results of experience and not merely conjectural proposals. Now certain results of this experience are present for all to see, and all comrades may now judge whether we properly understood our duties and what should be thought of people that strive to mislead those unacquainted with the immediate past, simply because they are piqued at our having pointed out to some their inconsistency on the national question, and to others the inadmissibility of their vacillation in matters of principle. Section 5.2. Can a newspaper be a collective organizer? The quintessence of the article Where to Begin consists in the fact that it discusses precisely this question and gives an affirmative reply to it. As far as we know, the only attempt to examine this question on its merits and to prove that it must be answered in the negative was made by L. Nadejdin, whose argument we reproduce here in full. Quote, It pleased us greatly to see Iskra number 4 present the question of the need for an all-Russian newspaper, but we cannot agree that this presentation bears relevance to the title Where to Begin. Undoubtedly, this is an extremely important matter, but neither a newspaper, nor a series of popular leaflets, nor a mountain of manifestos can serve as the basis for a militant organization in revolutionary times. We must set to work to build strong political organizations in the localities. We lack such organizations. We have been carrying on our work mainly among enlightened workers, while the masses have been engaged almost exclusively in the economic struggle. If strong political organizations are not trained locally, what significance will even an excellently organized all-Russia newspaper have? It'll be a burning bush, burning without being consumed, but firing no one. Iskra thinks that around it and in the activities in its behalf, people will gather and organize. But they will find it far easier to gather and organize around activities that are more concrete. This something more concrete must and should be the extensive organization of local newspapers, the immediate preparation of the workers' forces for demonstrations, the constant activity of local organizations among the unemployed, indefatigable distribution of pamphlets and leaflets, convening of meetings, appeals to actions of protest against the government, etc. We must begin live political work in the localities, and when the time comes to unite on this real basis, it will not be an artificial paper unity. Not by means of newspapers can such a unification of local work into an all-Russia cause be achieved. We have emphasized the passages in this eloquent tirade that most clearly show the author's incorrect judgment of our plan, as well as the incorrectness of his point of view in general, which is here contraposed to that of Iskra. Unless we train strong political organizations in the localities, even an excellently organized all-Russian newspaper will be of no avail. This is incontrovertible. But the whole point is that there is no other way of training strong political organizations except through the medium of an all-Russian newspaper. The author missed the most important statement Iskra made before it proceeded to set forth its plan, that it was necessary, quote, to call for the formation of a revolutionary organization capable of uniting all forces and guiding the movement in actual practice and not in name alone, that is, an organization ready at any time to support every protest and every outbreak and use it to build up and consolidate the fighting forces suitable for the decisive struggle, unquote. But now, after the February and March events, everyone will agree with this in principle, continues Iskra. Yet what we need is not a solution of the question in principle, but its practical solution. We must immediately advance a definite constructive plan through which all may immediately set to work to build from every side. Now we are again being dragged away from the practical solution towards something which in principle is correct, indisputable, and great, but which is entirely inadequate and incomprehensible to the broad masses of workers, namely, quote, to rear strong political organizations. This is not the point at issue, most worthy author. The point is how to go about the rearing and how to accomplish it. It is not true to say that, quote, we have been carrying on our work mainly among enlightened workers, while the masses have been engaged almost exclusively in the economic struggle, unquote. Presented in such a form, the thesis reduces itself to Svoboda's usual but fundamentally false contraposition of the enlightened workers to the, quote, masses. In recent years, even the enlightened workers have been, quote, engaged almost exclusively in the economic struggle, unquote. That is the first point. On the other hand, the masses will never learn to conduct the political struggle until we help to train leaders for this struggle, both from among the enlightened workers and from among the intellectuals. Such leaders can acquire training solely by systematically evaluating all the everyday aspects of our political life, all attempts at protest and struggle on the part of the various classes and on various grounds. Therefore, to talk of, quote, rearing political organizations, and at the same time to contrast the, quote, paperwork of a political newspaper to, quote, live political work in the localities is plainly ridiculous. Iskra has adopted its plan for newspaper to the plan for creating a, quote, militant preparedness to support the unemployed movement, peasant revolts, discontent among the Zemstvo people, quote, popular indignation against some czarist Bashi Bazook on the rampage, unquote, etc. Anyone who is at all acquainted with the movement knows full well that the vast majority of local organizations have never even dreamed of these things, that many of the prospects of, quote, live political work, here indicated, have never been realized by a single organization, that the attempt, for example, to call attention to the growth of discontent and protest among the Zemstvo intelligentsia rouses feelings of consternation and perplexity in Nadezhdin, quote, good Lord, is this newspaper intended for Zemstvo people, among the economists, and among many practical workers. Under these circumstances, it is possible to, quote, begin only by inducing people to think about all these things, to summarize and generalize all the diverse signs of ferment and active struggle. In our time, when social democratic tasks are being degraded, the only way, quote, live political work can be begun is with live political agitation, which is impossible unless we have an all-Russian newspaper, frequently issued and regularly distributed. Those who regard the Iskra, quote, plan as a manifestation of, quote, bookishness have totally failed to understand its substance and take for the goal that which is suggested as the most suitable means for the present time. These people have not taken the trouble to study the two comparisons that were drawn to present a clear illustration of the plan. Iskra wrote, the publication of an all-Russia political newspaper must be the main line by which we may unswervingly develop, deepen, and expand the organization, viz., the revolutionary organization that is ever ready to support every protest and every outbreak. Pray tell me, when bricklayers lay bricks in various parts of an enormous, unprecedentedly large structure, is it, quote, paper work to use a line to help them find the correct place for the bricklaying, to indicate to them the ultimate goal of the common work, to enable them to use not only every brick, but even every piece of brick, which, cemented to the bricks laid before and after it, forms a continuous, finished line? And are we not now passing through precisely such a period in our party life, when we have bricks and bricklayers but lack the guideline for all to see and follow? Let them shout that in stretching out the line, we want to command. Had we desired to command, gentlemen, we would have written it on the title page, not Iskra number 1, but Rabochia Gazeta number 3, as we were invited to do by certain comrades, and as we